Hi everybody, we're doing enclosed seam samples this week. So this is something that you would use when you have a seam that is not exposed but is enclosed or essentially hidden. So you can think about these enclosed seams as areas like inside of a waistband where you close off the waistband completely. Maybe inside of the cuff of a sleeve. Like inside of a pocket even, because you won't be able to see the seam inside the pocket once you sew it on. These areas are areas where you still need to seam, so we still use our 5/8 seam to connect the fabric together, but we need to do something to the enclosed area to take away the bulk. And so what I have for you guys, you have a stencil that looks like this. It's kind of this weird curved ladder shape or staircase shape. What you need to do is you need to print that out, and then you're going to cut 2 pieces of fabric in that shape. You're going to put them right sides together, pin them along the shaped edge, and then you're going to stitch it at 5/8. So I've already gone ahead and done the stitching. I've already back stitched along the curve. This is going to be your second curve. You did your stay stitching sample and you guys did a really good job with those. So now you guys are doing this curve on the edge of your enclosed seam, and then you're going to come around this second curve, and then you're going to have some corners. So what you want to make sure of is that you want to make sure that you get your seam gauge out. You want your seam gauge out so that you can mark these corners. So what you'll do is you'll use your marking tool. You'll find 5/8 on your seam gauge, and you'll make a mark along this edge and along this edge, so that you know when you get to 5/8 this is where you're going to pivot. You want to do the same thing on this corner here. So what you do is you bring your seam gauge and you mark along 5/8 down here, and you mark along 5/8 along here. And so what you can do is you can find the point where these two meet, and that is going to be where you pivot also. So you've got a couple of pivot points, and then again you're going to want to find the pivoting point on this edge here. So line, and it tells you I need to pivot. I want you to absolutely turn 1, 2, 3 corners and backstitch on the end here. Please don't stitch across, come down, because we're going to use these corners as an example of things that you would do for enclosed seams. So once you've stitched them 5/8 along the curve, making sure to follow the curved line. I don't want this to be jagged. I don't want it to be straight and kind of, you know, pointed. I want it really nice, and I want it to follow the curve perfectly. Then what we're going to do is we're going to start with the first of 4 techniques. So enclosed seams require 4 different techniques. I'm going to pull out the handout that I normally give in class, so where you guys can see. For enclosed seams, we focus on trimming, notching, clipping, and grading. Okay, so normally when we do this in class, you'll get a piece of paper that says enclosed seams at the top, and then it says the techniques that we're using at the bottom. So what we're going to start with is trimming. So that's our first thing that we're going to focus on. And what I like to say with trimming an enclosed seam, remember a seam that's going to be inside hidden. What you do is you think of trimming as going to the barber or to the stylist and getting your hair trimmed. They don't trim just one, they trim all your hairs. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna trim off 1/8 of an inch off of all layers. So right now we have 2 layers. So we're gonna trim off both layers. If we had 4 layers, we'd trim off all 4 layers. So again, this is all like getting your hair trimmed. So we're gonna go and we're gonna take off about 1/8 of an inch off of all layers. This is to help eliminate bulk. This is just to Shorten the seam allowance, that way there's not as much fabric stuck inside the enclosed seam once you're done, or once you're wearing the garment, once it's produced. So I'm taking off 1/8 of an inch off of all seam allowances, so both layers, and I'm going around the curve and being mindful to only take off 1/8. Okay, 1/8. Perfect. Okay, so now I have this chunk right here. So I'm gonna leave all this here so you guys can kind of see how much I end up removing in the end. It's kind of nice to see the difference. Okay, so now you can notice it's a little bit shorter. Instead of being 5/8, it's a 1/2 inch now. Okay, now the second thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna do this thing called grading. I like for you guys to think of grading as like a grading class. You start with an A, you get a B, you get a C, you get a D. Gradually it gets lower and lower. That's what we're gonna do with this seam. We're gonna grade them, meaning we're gonna trim one seam at a time a little bit more so that it gradually gets smaller. When it comes to this, we only have 2 of them. So we're gonna trim one of the seams, just one of them, another 1/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna pick, doesn't matter which side really for this. If it had interfacing on it, which we haven't really got to yet, if it had interfacing though, I would choose the side with interfacing. But for now, I'm gonna pick a side, doesn't matter which, and I'm gonna trim off an additional 1/8 of an inch. And so what you'll see when I do this is you'll see that plaid with the little red paisley shows through. So, scissors and trimming. I'm going into the corner here. And again, I'm only taking off another 1/8. Okay. So I have one over here that's kind of already done, so you guys can see that one of these is longer than the other. This one is shorter. Okay, so that's the idea here, is that we're shortening one of these seam allowances. And not both, just one. If you had, let's say, 3 or 4 layers, you would trim one down 1/8, another down by 1/8, and then maybe in the last one you don't touch, or if you have 4 of them, let's say, then you just trim that one down by a hair more. The reason why we trim them, or grade them, I'm sorry, at different lengths is because we want it to feel like you can't tell where the seam allowance starts and stops inside of the enclosed seam. So let's say that this was a collar or a cuff. You don't want to grab onto your collar or your cuff and feel a really bulky amount of fabric on the inside. You want it to seem as though it's, you know, pretty flat and almost an endless seam. So to do that, we are going to grade the thicknesses to different lengths. Okay, so that takes a little bit of time. Make sure that you see one that is shorter than the other, because we only have 2 layers here. Okay, now we're gonna move on to this word called notching. Now when you think of notching, you can think about the way that notches look in patterns. They kind of look like these triangle shapes, right? When you notch something in your commercial patterns. Well, those notches, they're a little bit different when it comes to enclosed seams. Instead of cutting them outwards, we cut them inwards, but they're the same shape and the same idea. So what I like to think of when I think of this word notch too, I'm going to bring it back in, is I like to think of the O in notch. Notching is done on outside curves and corners. Okay, outside curves and corners. What that means is that if you have a circle, and if your seam allowance sits outside of the circle, this is an outside seam allowance. If you have a circle and the seam allowance sits inside of it, this is an inside. Okay? That was a little bit confusing, so we'll talk about it again on our sample. So if I looked at this stitch here, made out of thread, and I were to draw a circle just following along this seam or stitch that I've created. So I'm just gonna make a circle to kind of mimic that curve. Is my seam allowance inside the circle or is it outside my circle? It's obviously outside. So this would be one of the instances where you have a curve where the seam allowance is outside. So I would want to notch. I'd want to notch, and what that is I would want to take out triangles. So I'm gonna flip this over, and along this curved edge, I'm gonna take out triangle shapes going to, but not through the stitching line. Okay, and I'm gonna do them about every 1/2 inch or so. And they're gonna be about 1/4 to 1/2 inch wide. Okay, about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch wide. And again, I'm doing it all along this outside curve. So as long as it's curvy and as long as it's an outside curve, I'm going to do this notching method. Again, I like to think of the O in notch and the O in outside. Now I'm coming up to a part of this stitch where it kind of looks like a straight line to me. So it's looking a little straight here. So I don't really need to notch this because it's pretty much a straight line. If I took a ruler to it, it's pretty straight. So I don't really have to worry about notching that because that's a straight line. But then I come up to this area here where it's curvy again. Well, let's see. Let's see if we can make a circle on this curve. So if I were to take this curve and make a circle, is my seam allowance inside the circle or outside the circle? It's clearly inside. So this would be considered an inside curve. So I need to not notch this, but what I'll do is I will clip this. Okay, clipping. So I like to think of the I in clipping and the I in inside. Sorry, my dog's barking. Okay, what a clip is what it kind of sounds like. It's just kind of taking your scissors and clipping, snipping. Okay, just making a little snip. Okay, I'm gonna take my scissors then, and instead of making triangle cuts like I made here, I'm just going to clip to but not through this stitch every 1/2 inch or so, where the stitch seems like it's curving. And again, this is an inside curve. Okay, so do you see how these are now fanning out? The reason why we do different types of techniques on outside curves and inside curves is because of the way that they sit when they're flipped right side out. So this is currently an outside curve while the fabric is inside out. But when I go to flip this to the right side, the way we're gonna wear it or the way we're gonna see it, this is no longer, the seam allowance is no longer outside, but it's now shoved inside of this small area. So if you didn't cut out triangles of fabric, you would end up with a lumpy, big chunk of seam allowance stuck in this smaller area because you need to remove some of that bulk with these notches. And the opposite goes for the inside curves. Right now, while it's inside out, this is an inside curve. But when you go to flip it, the way you would wear it with the pretty side out, then you need to create these clips to release the tension that would be pulling. So this would be pulling and it would be stuck together. You need to clip, snipping to but not through, in order to release the tension so that it's not tight, but opens up. The same thing goes for inside and outside corners. So if I were to take my marking tool, and if I were to trace around this corner that I just created here, so I'm gonna make a little box here, okay, is my seam allowance inside or outside of this corner? It's outside. So I'm gonna take that same idea from the notch, the O and outside, the O and notch, and I'm gonna notch off or take a big chunk of triangle out of this outside corner. So I'm just gonna chop that off, going to but not through that stitch. Okay, so I've just taken a triangle chunk off, similar to what I did up here with triangles. I'm now going to do the corner here. So if I were to draw a box on top, is my seam allowance inside or outside of this box? It's inside of it, it's all here. So I'm gonna clip to but not through this corner. So I'm gonna clip it to but not through all the way, okay, through that corner. Nice. Okay, my very last corner is here at the very end, and I'm going to trace that out. And I'm gonna see, is my seam allowance inside or outside of it? It's outside, so that would be the notch. I'm gonna notch off that corner, to but not through the stitch. So what you can see now is I have notched my outside curve, notched off the ends of my outside corners, I've clipped my inside curve, I've clipped my inside corner. I've removed a ton of bulk, so this pile right here all would have been stuck inside of my, let's say, collar, or inside of my cuff, or inside of my neckband or stand. That's a lot of fabric to have as extra material that we don't need. So we're gonna eliminate all this bulk. We're gonna get rid of all that, and we're gonna make it nice and flat and smooth, not bulky, by doing these 4 techniques. The trimming of 1/8 of an inch off of everything starts the process. Think about trimming your hair. The grading, taking down layer by layer, gradually shorter. That's like getting your hair layered. So imagine, getting your hair layered, they go a little bit at a time. That helps to remove even more bulk. The notching removes bulk from the inside after it's pretty side out, and the clipping removes tension. Okay, this is really important because we're gonna use this technique in pretty much every sample from now on. A lot of what we do from now on is gonna be in clothes. We're gonna do, collars and cuffs and facings and all these different things that are you're not gonna see the seam allowance. Look inside of things that you wear, your jeans, your dresses, your blouses, your button-up shirts. You don't see seam allowances all too often. And if you do, they're surged. But a lot of times they're hidden, they're enclosed. So you wanna take the idea from this sample and you wanna carry it to the samples in the future. The last thing that you need to do for these samples is you need to take them and you need to press them open. Now it's a little difficult to press these because we don't have a lot of ironing equipment, but what you could do is you could take like a kitchen towel and kind of bunch it up and put it inside of this seam, and you're gonna press it open. And you're going to bunch up that kitchen towel and put the iron on it and press this open. And pivot and press this point open and press this open as well. Okay, this is going to be the hard part going along this curve. So what you can do too, if you don't feel comfortable using a kitchen towel, you can use your iron to press these open flat. So I would, with my fabric flat on the ironing board, I would use my iron to kind of push the seams away from each other. As long as you press it open, all the work that you did will show from the outside, so it'll look pretty on the outside. If you leave it like this and you go to turn it, I'll show you, all the work you did isn't really gonna show up too well because you're gonna get areas like this where it's still kind of getting stuck and rolling on the inside here. That doesn't look too great. You wanna press it, you wanna make sure that you press it and press it well, so that when you flip it like this one, which has been pressed already, it lays really flat. Another thing that you may want to invest in, I didn't require you to purchase these for this class, but my intermediate students need to buy them, and my intermediate students use them often, is this pointer and tracer, which, looks like this. This is great because they come in wood and in a high melting point plastic. And what you can do is you can use it to poke out your corners safely without popping a hole through it. So you'll see I'm going to use this nice little pointed corner to get my corner beautifully pushed. Same thing here, I'm going to use it to push out this corner without poking through. So if you use your scissors, a lot of times what happens when you use scissors for this is it just goes and stabs clean through. And if that's one of your projects, that's going to be an issue. It has a curved end, so it's got a pointy end for corners and a curved end for curves. And you can take this curved end and you can run it along your curved seam to help press out that seam allowance. So then you end up with this really nice, beautiful, flat outside enclosed seam. Nothing looks really bulky. You can feel it. You can run your fingers along the seam and it just feels really gradual. You can tell there's fabric in there, but you can't, it's not a big chunk and then it doesn't like abruptly end. It's gradual, kind of fades away. Beautiful from both sides. So when you guys submit this, I would love for you to take a picture of it from the outside. Just one image of it from the outside, please. And then I would like for you to take a picture of the seam flat on the table, inside out, from the graded side where you can see the difference in lengths. Okay, so one image so that I can see your stitch, so I can see your notching, your clipping, your notching, your clipping and your notching, and then the trimming and grading that's happened all the way along the seam.